there, and welcome to the Power of Zero show. I am your host, bestselling author David McKnight. I'm the author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You LERP, The Volatility Shield, and most recently, Tax-Free Income for Life. If you have not picked up any of those books, you can do so on Amazon, or you can buy them in bulk at davidmcknightbooks.com. If you are looking for someone to help you navigate all of the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, I would suggest that you head over to davidmcknight.com. You can set up a strategy session. We will hook you up with a member of our elite POZ advisor group. They are among the top 50 tax-free retirement specialists in the nation. They've been trained, vetted, qualified personally by me, and they work very, very closely with our office. We take a look at every recommendation that goes out to you, and it gets our stamp of approval. And if you're an advisor who wants to level up your game and become and adopt a Power of Zero worldview and become the tax-free planning specialist in your community, head over to powerofzero.com and schedule a phone call. We would love to chat with you. You can always follow me on Twitter at Dave McKnight & Co. That's at McKnight & Co. at McKnight & Co. And you can follow me on Instagram, David C. McKnight. All right, today we're going to talk about something that I've really been thinking a lot about lately, and I think that it's something that poses a threat to our republic. And I really want to get into it because I think it's pernicious. I think it's a bit of a fairy tale, and I think there's no rigorous academic backing for what we're going to talk about today. And that's what we call modern monetary theory. Now, modern monetary theory is something you may have heard about. It's gaining a lot of traction among some very, very left-leaning economists. There was a book written recently by Stephanie Kelton, who incidentally has, we share literary agents, which is interesting because I advocate an economic approach that's 180 degrees opposites, literally antithetical to everything that she talks about. By the way, Stephanie Kelton was the economic advisor to the Bernie Sanders campaign. By the way, I try to keep these episodes as apolitical as possible. This is probably going to be the episode that comes as close to showing, as close to seeming political as any of my other episodes, though I'm trying very, very hard and diligently to remain apolitical. MMT, as you will soon see, modern monetary theory, MMT, is less an economics approach than it is a political approach, and I think it needs to be called out as such. So I'm going to be using as a source today an article by Jonathan Hartley, who is a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity and also a master's in public policy candidate at Harvard. And he has a lot of interesting things to say about modern monetary theory. And you may think, wow, this is sort of a wonkish topic for Dave to talk about today. The reason I'm bringing it up is because there are economists and primarily politicians in certain quarters who believe that MMT, modern monetary theory, will solve all of our economic problems, that debts don't matter, that printing money doesn't matter, that we can spend with with carte blanche approach, and it won't have any implications long term for our country or for our fiscal situation. If we want something, we should just be able to pay for it by borrowing or printing. There are no adverse economic consequences for doing so. So let's get into his article. I'm going to be quoting from his article, and I'll be commenting on what I read. I think that this is important because, as David Walker said in the interview that I had with him a month or so ago, he says, if we adopt a modern monetary theory by 2040, our country will really be paying the price. We are already in fiscal straits as it is, and if we adopt a modern monetary theory approach, it will completely exacerbate and send our country into a fiscal spiral from which it may not recover in any short amount of time. So he begins by saying that MMT believes that so long as government's debt is denominated in its own currency, there is no upper limit on the country's monetary borrowing. This is a principal tenet of their program. You can borrow as much money as you want, okay? In other words, public debt is irrelevant. A country's central bank can always avoid default by printing more money. There's an important part. I'm going to repeat this, okay? Such printing, MMT proponents further argue, can go on without inflationary consequences. I had a Twitter battle with a MMT, a modern monetary theory proponent, over the course of last week. And true to form, he maintained that you can print as much money as you want and deal with no deleterious consequences. The idea is that if you print all this money and you use it for public projects or to pay for a $15 minimum wage or to give free college to all, that all of those things will grow the economy, and therefore, as the economy grows and the supply of money keeps pace with a growing economy, then you will not have inflation, as you will soon see. That is a fairy tale. He continues, they thus call for economists to shed their superstitious fear of debt and for policymakers to unleash the full power of unlimited risk-free government spending. Doesn't that phrase alone just put fear into your soul? Full power of unlimited risk-free government spending. He says it should come as no surprise that some of the loudest supporters for MMT in the United States come from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. After all, if measures of public debt signify nothing beyond future currency production goals for the U.S. Treasury, then there is no real limit to the amount government can spend on massive programs like universal free college, a Green New Deal, a universal basic income, or a universal jobs guarantee. In other words, if there are no adverse consequences to printing an unlimited amount of money or accessing what Stephanie Kelton calls the infinity bucket, then we should have no limits on the types of economic benefits or initiatives that we should be adopting in our country. If you can dream it, you can have it. That's sort of the approach. I mean, you sort of have to ask yourself over the course of this podcast, does this approach pass the sniff test? Okay. If you smell a fish by the end, then your most, innermost impulses are probably correct. He says the sudden need for deficit spending in the wake of global pandemic should not be used as an excuse to embrace MMT. While they may be convenient, MMT's central claims regarding the harmlessness of deficits, debt, and mass currency production are not only flatly false, they are deeply dangerous. And of course, I've been trying to tell that story. Ed Slott has told that story. David Walker has told that story, that these are dangerous, dangerous things. So not only are they wrong, but if implemented, they could send our country even deeper into an economic crisis. So according to MMT, governments can borrow and print as much of their own domestic currency as necessary without causing inflation. Now, to understand modern monetary theory's appeal, we have to first sort of understand the three basic ways that you can eliminate debt, okay? The first, or at least the three basic theories about governmental debt. Now, remember, you can't default. Constitutionally, we can't default. So these are really the only three ways that you can reduce debt. The first is by reducing fiscal deficits, and you can do that by either raising taxes, cutting spending, or some combination of the two. We've been advocating for that approach forever. The second one is to grow your way out of the problem. And if you've watched The Power Zero, the Tax Train is Coming, Joseph Davis, who is the chief global economist for Vanguard, he says, it would be impossible to grow our way out of our debt. If you can see me on YouTube, this is what 5% growth looks like. And this is what our Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, spending over the next 75 years looks like. It just goes up in a huge curve, whereas 5% growth doesn't even come close to defraying those costs. So you can grow your way out of the problem, which we know is not feasible. And he says, lastly, you can use central banks to print money and monetize that. He says the first option often gets the most attention from mainstream economists. That's the one that I give the most attention to, while MMT proponents insist that government pursue the third. Nobody feels like we can grow our way out of debt at this point. Now, MMT theorists will often point to Japan, and they'll say, hey, look, Japan has got 250% debt to GDP ratio, and they seem to be doing just fine. Therefore, we should not have any concern over whether MMT works on, in a broad economy like in the case of Japan. What Japan has done, however, to avoid a financial crisis has been by they essentially have done exactly what I've advocated for, which is they've cut social spending, pensions, healthcare. They've kept that low, and they've also increased taxes by way of a value-added tax. So essentially, they raise taxes and they cut spending. So even though Japan's central bank, they've also held short-term interest rates close to zero for decades, but we do know that if interest rates were to creep up, as in our country, the ability to service their debt would be radically curtailed. We've long said that the only reason the debt is not a big deal at this point is because interest rates are at or near zero. When they start returning to historically normal levels, we'll talk about what might bring that about here in a second, then we will know, we'll start hearing about this much more in the news because it's going to start consuming more and more of the federal budget. In other words, Japan is by no stretch of the imagination out of the woods, because if interest rates go up, they're going to need more revenue to be able to meet their debt obligations. Now, there are certain special qualities, he continues, that give the United States an added ability to borrow. The U.S. Treasury has a unique ability to borrow at lower rates. Why? Because their debt is being issued in the world's reserve currency. That's what makes it unique. Now, how long will we be the world's reserve currency? Well, who knows? But as long as it is, it allows us to borrow at lower rates. However, this special quality does not eliminate the fact that sooner or later one does run out of other people's money. Okay, this is important. Okay, even though we can borrow it at lower rates as a result of being the world's reserve currency, there's a catch, there's a proviso here. And this is what he says. Eventually, interest costs on government debt become as large as the state's revenue. At which point, by the way, that means your debt to GDP ratio is essentially 100%. Eventually, interest costs on government debt become as large as the state's revenue, at which point investors, no longer believing the government to be solvent, will refuse to buy bonds or lend to the government at manageable interest rates. So while the United States almost certainly could stomach more debt at present, interest costs will eventually subsume all other government revenues. Interest rates being close to zero certainly slows down this process. But once inflation eventually rises, so too will interest rates and the interest costs of public debt. So in other words, this is all great so long as interest rates stay low. But in the event that interest rates start to rise, all bets are off. Okay, for Japan, for us, and anybody else who is basically borrowing to pay their bills. MMT advocates, modern monetary theory advocates, however, deny the existence of this limit on debt printed in a government's own currency. They therefore embrace the third option for public debt reduction, using central banks to print money and monetize debt. In other words, they simply say you can borrow as much as you want because you can always pay the interest on that debt by simply printing more money. Is this starting to sound crazy? Is this starting to sound untenable to you? Well, don't worry, you're not alone. Let's talk about the history of this. MMT proponents argue that central banks can print money without triggering dangerous levels of inflation. This, of course, ignores the history of debt monetization leading to hyperinflation in the cases of Austria, Hungary, Poland, and Weimar Germany during the first half of the 20th century. I'm going to talk about Weimar Germany because I think it's probably the most salient example of a country who tried to print their way out of their problems. So he talks about Germany in the immediate wake of World War I. He says that Germany had financed its war effort through deficit spending and suspension of the gold standard, believing that it would be able to achieve a swift, decisive victory and pay off its debt by annexing wealthier territories and imposing reparations on its defeated enemies. What occurred was very much the opposite. Over 4 long years of fighting, Germany accumulated a considerable war debt while significantly devaluing its currency, the German mark. And since Germany was on the losing side of the war, instead of being paid reparations, it owed staggering levels of reparations to the Allies at the war's end. So they were counting on the fact that they could extract reparations from the people that lost the war. Well, they lost the war and they had to pay reparations. So it's sort of a reversal in fortunes. Making matters worse, the Reparations Committee demanded Germany pay 132 billion gold marks as part of the London payment plan. In other words, they bombed London, now they got to pay to repair it. The German government responded by printing more German marks to pay what it owed, which only devalued its currency further. In 1922, Germany failed to pay an installment it owed to France, which prompted the French occupation of Germany's primary industrial region to ensure repayment. The German government responded by calling for what amounted to a strike, then offered for the workers' financial support, again financed by printing more currency and issuing loans at interest rates far below the rate of inflation. By 1923, German currency was worthless. $1 US at the time was equivalent to 4,210,500 million German marks. And then he goes on to say, he said, you may think that this is sort of, a phenomenon of the distant past, but he says there's been lots of examples of hyperinflation in the immediate past. And he gives examples like Brazil, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Let's talk about Zimbabwe because I always like to talk about Zimbabwe. My son actually did a service project in Zimbabwe and came home with, I think he talked about a loaf of bread costs $100 trillion. They just keep adding zeros to their currency. Let's talk about Zimbabwe. The trouble began in the late 1990s, when the government adopted several spending plans, including the compulsory government purchase of white-owned commercial farms and generous pension plans for veterans of the country's War of Independence, without budgeting for them. That sound familiar? This triggered panic among foreign investors who pulled capital from the Zimbabwean markets, thereby causing a crash of the country's currency. Subsequent unwise military ventures drove Zimbabwe further into debt. Meanwhile, the forced seizure of farmland and resulting violence nearly halted all agricultural production. Since the Zimbabwean economy is too fragile to grow its way out of debt, and imposing new taxes to raise revenue was a political non-starter, monetary and fiscal authorities began to monetize the country's debt by printing more money. This ultimately led to hyperinflation so extreme, an estimated 79 billion% per month. In November 2008, the Zimbabwe was effectively forced to substitute its own currency with the US dollar shortly thereafter through a process economists call dollarization. So we know there's historical precedent for massive hyperinflation when you try to print your way out of your problems. So all of this begs the question, if MMT is so great, modern monetary theory is something that really smart people are countenancing, espousing, if you will, where is the evidence that from academia that these principles are sort of grounded in real pragmatic economic theory? Well, the reality is it's not. It doesn't exist. And this is what he says. He says, since MMT was first developed, mainstream economists have repeatedly pointed out its flaws. A recent Chicago Booth IGM Forum survey of 50 of the most respected academic economists found that not a single respondent agreed with the central claims of MMT regarding deficits, currency production, or inflation. Even left-leaning Keynesian economists like Larry Summers and Paul Krugman, the New York Times, have loudly denounced MMT claims as dangerous and obviously indefensible, respectively. And this is where it gets good. He says, the strangest feature of MMT then is the simple fact that it has managed to develop the following it currently enjoys. Economic professors, billionaire thought leaders, and several members of Congress, including most notably Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have heaped lavish praise on MMT as the economic theory of the future. Yet with no serious mainstream economists stepping up to do anything other than attack MMT, how does this theory of economics continue to cultivate a base of high-profile supporters? And this is where MMT ventures into the realm of almost religious belief, okay? There's no serious no serious mathematical or economical precedents or grounding for what people are beginning to espouse. It is more in the realm of religious or even just political wish-making. Give you an example. He says, an answer to this question may have to do with the peculiar nature of MMT, which upon closer inspection appears to have more in common with a political or moral ideological movement than it does with a theory of economics. Like other ideologues, MMT advocates begin with the assertion that their policy goals, providing jobs for all, paying for college for all, etc., are correct. From there, they assume that the means to achieve these ends must exist. This is not a falsifiable scientific theory. It is rather a political and moral statement by those who believe in the righteousness and affordability of unlimited government spending to achieve progressive ends. In other words, basically, they're saying we hope and believe that all of these policy initiatives are righteous and worthy of pursuit. Therefore, there has to be some economic means of pulling it off. So you can see that it's almost a fairy tale to believe that you can simply print money and pay for everything you want without having real life economic consequences for doing so. He concludes by saying, indeed, what makes MMT unique is that it's the only school of thought to combine calls for not only increased but unlimited deficit spending with the argument that central banks can print money to pay off these debts without prompting inflation. There's simply no, he says, there's simply no truth to this assertion. In fact, the reality is much the opposite. As interest costs consume increasing portions of revenue, at a certain point, the government cannot afford to borrow any longer. If the government resorts to printing money to pay its debts, inflation will ultimately follow. So, if I could sort of summarize what the main flaw in modern monetary theory is, I think it says it pretty clearly right now. You can't simply borrow in perpetuity. Okay, you can't borrow in perpetuity. If you borrow in perpetuity, the people that are borrowing the money from you, or sorry, the people that you're loaning the money to, the people you're borrowing the money from, sooner or later they begin to be skeptical as to whether you can pay the money back. Therefore, they will either stop loaning you the money or they will demand a higher rate, and that will force interest rates higher. Once interest rates go higher, then inflation will likewise go higher. Those two things are sort of inextricably connected. Lastly, he says, in searching for radical theories to advocate radical policies, MMT apologists have inadvertently come to endorse an approach to economic theory that not only flies in the face of decades of economic research and historical precedent, but would be devastating if ever tested by tempting progressive politicians into endorsing dangerous and obviously indefensible economic theories. MMT advocates are setting the stage for potentially disastrous policymaking. So, long story short, there are only a couple of different ways that we can fix our problems. We can either reduce spending, we can raise revenue, or some combination of the two. MMT, modern monetary theorists, want you to believe that there is a different alternative. There's a second alternative. I don't think anyone believes that growing our way out of our problems at this point is going to do it, but they believe in the second alternative, which says that we can print our way out of our problems. And so long as that debt is denominated in our currency, we can print as much as we want. It's a fairy tale. It's dangerous. I think it could exacerbate in fundamental ways the current path that we're on. So modern monetary theory, you'll hear about it more and more as left-leaning politicians advocate for programs that simply can't be paid for through the normal means. They'll say, let's just print more money. And I think it'll become more and more popular as time wears on. But you have to remember that no mainstream economists really believe that this is a viable solution to fixing our country's problems. All right, thanks for listening. Once again, if you want to have some help on navigating all of the challenges and pitfalls and roadblocks that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, we're happy to help. Go to davidmcknight.com and we will hook you up with an advisor in your area. If you are a financial advisor who wants to start adopting these principles in your practice, you can head over to powerzero.com. Once again, you can follow me on Twitter at McKnight & Co. or on Instagram, David C. McKnight. And also, hey, subscribe to my podcast. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for being on the podcast this week. We will look forward to chatting with you the same time next week.